Hi y'all. Oh my gosh, thanks for quieting down. This is the most attentive, obedient crowd in the world. Thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Alexa and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. We're so excited to be hosting a panel with some of Unnamed Press's debut authors, Laura Venita Green, Michelle Gurule, Gurule. I'm so sorry, y'all. Michael Jerome Plunkett in conversation with Brandon Taylor. Before I get started, I just want to point out some logistics for how tonight's event's going to go. We're going to be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A at the end of the event, so you can start thinking of some good questions now. And then after the talk tonight, Laura, Michelle, and Michael will be signing and personalizing books after the discussion, and I'll let you know how to line up for that at the end. If you're joining us on the YouTube live stream, please buy copies from the link in the description box below. That's what they're there for. If you're here in person, please buy more copies at the front. All right. Unnamed Press is a Los Angeles-based independent book publisher. Founded in 2014, the press started with an interest in featuring international and underrepresented voices. Brandon Taylor, who's here with us tonight, is their acquiring editor, and we'll hear more about everyone's debut books during the discussion. I'll quickly introduce our authors, and then we're off to the races. Laura Venita Green holds an MFA in Fiction and Translation from Columbia University, where she was an undergraduate teaching fellow. She grew up in Germany in rural Louisiana and currently lives with her husband in New York City. I'm getting fired. New York City. Sister Creatures is her debut novel. Michelle Gurule is a writer and educator based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Michelle earned her MFA in Creative Nonfiction from the University of New Mexico. Her creative work explores the complexity of sex work, class, power, and Michelle's intersectional identity as a queer white Chicana woman. Thank You, John is her debut memoir. Michael Jerome Plunkett is a writer from Long Island, a Marine Corps veteran, and a former EMT. He is the co-founder and executive director of Literature of War Foundation and host of the Lit War podcast. Zone Rouge is his debut novel. Brandon Taylor is the author of the novels The Late Americans and Real Life, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize, and named a New York Times New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and selected title by the National Book Foundation. His collection, Filthy Animals, a national bestseller, was awarded the Story Prize and shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize, and he lives in New York City. All right, y'all, without further delay, please join me in giving everyone a warm welcome.
New York Sister. That's a sick title. Should we do a collaborative book called New York Sister? Now I'm just like my mind is reeling. Okay, I'm gonna store that for later. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. Debuts are a special beast. They often take you your entire life to write them, and often we have this idea that they're the first book that the author wrote, but very often it's not the first book that the author wrote. It is merely the first public book that's out there, and so it's a really special thing that you're here to help celebrate these debuts, the starts of 3 really brilliant and exciting literary careers. So you're here, you're on the ground floor, people. You're buying low, but you're gonna sell high. We got 3 future Nobel laureates here on Nobel Day. So I'd love to hear each of you give the audience the dreaded elevator pitch. Could you each say just a little bit about what your books are about?
Over in France today, they are still cleaning up the unexploded bombs from the First World War, and the French government pays people to go out and disarm these bombs, and that's what Zone Rouge is about.
Wow, that was short. Okay. Sister Creatures follows 4 women from the same small town in Louisiana and a supernatural entity that looms over their lives. And it's about a lot of things, but I think it's about kind of dealing with our own flawed selves so we can be there for the ones we love.
My book, Thank You, John, is a memoir, and it is seemingly about 2 things that are not complementary, but it's about a sugar baby arrangement, and it's also about a family memoir about my family, and it sort of tries to answer the question of is sex work empowering or is it disempowering? And for me, it's not either of those things. What I find is that having financial security is empowering. So that's what it says.
So good. So good. You guys are so good at this. The Unnamed team, they're going to be so happy to hear that you guys are so good at talking about your books. I'm also a field agent for the Unnamed office. I'm reporting back on this event. Could you tell us now, what were the initial seeds of these books? Where did it start for you? We'll start with Michelle this time.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, for my book, I feel like when I actually went to my MFA, I've always wanted to write. I've always been a writer. It was just something that I couldn't help. I have a friend who's like, if you could do anything else, do something else, because it's just not a viable career for most of us. But I was just always writing about my family a lot, and I actually went to my MFA not talking about sex work because I was like leaving this sugar daddy arrangement, and I was like, oh, this is something I'm never ever going to talk about, and I just wanted to write about my family. But then I got in the program, and then I just couldn't help it. I just like kept coming at it, and I felt like I was like starting my life in a new city, and I thought, all right, if I'm meeting new people, this is like my chance to sort of come clean about like my life. And then I turned in like one submission, which was one of my later chapters, Exit Route, and my professor was like, this is actually an entire book. And then it just began, the book, from there.
Similarly, in my MFA, I had been struggling for 10 years just to write a book-length project, so just failing a lot. And I got there, and it was at Columbia, and at Columbia you could do also a translation track. So I was doing fiction and translation, and someone brought this translation of a German poem in, and one of the words they chose was sister creature, one word, and it just really made me think doppelganger. And I was also wanting to write weird fiction and just let things happen and kind of seed control. So I wrote a doppelganger story, and it got to the point where I had kind of a handful of stories of 5 different characters, and then I sort of used them as puzzle pieces to try to make an entire book. But this one doppelganger story from the word sister creature from a translated German poem is where it started.
Oh, sick.
In 2013, I just graduated from Gettysburg College, and I took a backpacking trip through Europe. And I'd spent my whole childhood going to Civil War battlefields, and if you've ever been to an American Civil War battlefield, there are big battles, but you can usually tell where things happen, right? You can say the Union Army was in this position over here, the Confederates attacked out of the tree line, then they flanked from this way and they got pushed back, and there it is. What I'd heard about European battlefields is when you go there, it is so colossal that you can't really figure out what happened. And I was like, I want to see one of these battlefields. And we had started in Italy, we were working our way up towards Ireland, and I had mapped it out. I was like, we're coming from Luxembourg, and we're literally going the way the German army was approaching Paris during World War I. We can stop at Verdun for 2 hours, get off the train, it's literally on the train line, see the battlefield real quick, take a quick tour, and be in Paris like nothing happened. And we stepped off the train, signed up for the first bus tour, and I saw this land and was just completely, had never seen anything like it. The land was still misshapen by the artillery shells, which created the craters. There were villages that they had left abandoned that you could still see all the shattered pottery and the stones from the foundation. And even the cemetery had a traditional military cemetery, but there was an ossuary where you could look into windows and see the bones of these soldiers who had been piled in there. And I was like, what is this place? I've never seen anything like it. And then our tour guide told me that we actually had to stay on the paths. Every time we stopped the bus, we'd get off, and there were these little trails you could walk through in the woods. And he said, don't go off the paths because we cannot guarantee your safety. And he said this every stop, and I was like, is this a bit? Are you serious? Is this trying to... And he's like, no, we literally have a department that the government pays to remove these artillery shells because farmers and civilians find them all the time. And then I had to get back on a train and go to Paris, and was like, what just happened there? I need to investigate this more. And it took me close to 10 years before I could even figure out a way into the story, but that was the initial seed.
Oh, that's crazy. You guys are wild. I am harrowed by all 3 of those stories. I'm like, you do what now? What I'm struck by in all 3 of those stories is that there seems to be a moment where you thought you were on one track and you sort of end up totally, not sidetracked, but you end up in a story that's different than the one you thought you were telling, which leads me, hopefully, to my next question, which is, what was the most surprising moment for this? Was there a moment in writing these books where that switch became legible to you? Like, oh, I really thought I was doing X, but in fact I am doing Y, and in fact the story has like taken on a life of its own, and I've gotta follow. What was that moment for you? The switch moment. We'll start with you in the middle now, Laura.
I think it was the moment, so I have this entity, Thea, that shows up in my book in a lot of different forms. She starts out as a creepy doll, but she's also a doppelganger and, a soot demon, all these things, but, very normal stuff. But I think that I had thought I could kind of control the concept for that, in that, okay, I have this weird character in this mostly realist book, how do I make that work? And it was a simplistic, okay, one of the other characters is actually imagining Thea. And in writing, she just became, despite me, so much bigger than that. And then there's this moment where she's kind of this meta narrative where she's like butting heads with the character that's supposed to be creating her. And then I just felt that that's how I feel when I'm writing, that I create these characters and they just go their own way and I don't have nearly as much control over them as I think, but just kind of letting that play out and letting her be much bigger than my intention is, I think, what kind of cracked this book open for me.
Yeah. I mean, it just does know that can be so scary though. When when you let the entity in and it just sort of takes over, like you don't know if you're going to be able to get it back in its box.
That's so true, but when you fail to make anything decent for a decade, you just kind of have to go with it.
Failure is the greatest teacher. Yes.
I think with my first draft, I have sort of like two spiritual guides, and one is Alanis Morissette, and one is Oprah Winfrey. And in my first draft, I think my agent, who's here, Hannah, I was told like, okay, you can't have Oprah and Alanis Morissette. They sort of serve the same purpose. But I was like so obsessed with Super Soul Sunday, I really was. And I think when I was like going through this arrangement, I was like, this is my destiny, which I still do feel. But I was like having such I like that whole first draft was kind of just like very like, oh my god, like this is, I don't know, I was like working at Whole Foods, and then I like one of the cashiers was like, I'm gonna go work at the strip club, and I was like, I used to work at the strip club, and then she was like, you should go back, and I was like, I should go back, and God has just told me that. And so I think that, then that's how I kind of laid everything out. And then I was working at the dance, stripping, and this guy came in and was like, here's my business card, call me if you want to have dinner. And I was like, I guess that's God told me to do this as well. And then it just kept progressing, and I think I wrote my whole book that way. And I really lived it when I was writing it. Like, this is awesome. This was just like, God led me through this, and things are so much better now. Now I'm writing my book and my MFA program. And then I think when I had to like take Oprah out, I had to just like, Alanis Morissette had to kind of come way back too. And then I feel like I had to, because I was sort of serving a lot of conversations with the self of like with a fake Oprah. And so when I took her out, I had to sort of just like go into myself, and then I feel like that made my book a lot more serious, and maybe helped me reflect as well. So it was good advice, Hannah. Thank you, and it really did make the book, I think, so much better.
The Oprah edit. Wow. I'm learning so much about you.
Yeah, writing fiction is such a strange process because you're making things up. You've got this spark, and like I said, it took me years before I could even figure out a way into this story. I think I was like deeply insecure about the fact that I'm not French. This is a culture. I was in this town for literally 2 hours, and that was it. And for years, I just obsessed over this place and thought about it and found things and did research. And listen, I believe in the power of imagination. I think you can go very far with that. But at some point, I needed to get back there, boots on the ground again, and just see what was, not for like the military aspect so much, but like what is going on in the town square on a Tuesday afternoon? Like, what does this place smell like? What are people's concerns? What is going on? And at that point, the big switch for me was I had this novel, and I probably had a couple of drafts now. And at the time, it started with a park ranger, like a forest ranger, going in and discovering one of these artillery shells coming out of the ground, and kicks off like a whole chain reaction of events. Book starts slightly differently now, but at the time, that's the way it started. And so when I was finally like, I got to go back there, right after my MFA, I think I was there for about 2 weeks, just by myself. Got a little Airbnb kind of situation and was just exploring the battlefield. 10 minutes after I got to town. I went out to the battlefield, parked my car right at that ossuary I was talking about before, and I knew there's a monument that I could get to, I wanted to check out if I cut through a strand of woods. And I'm taking this path through, and I'm walking along, and something catches my eye off to the side. Because when you're in a natural world, anything that's like an anomaly jumps out at you. And something that did not look natural at all was like poking out of the mud. And I was like, there's no way that's exactly what I think it is. And I did exactly what my tour guide told me not to do, which is I got off the path and I walked over and I was like, oh my God, I think that's what I think it is. And I did what you're definitely not supposed to do, and I started kind of kicking it with my feet. Marine Corps kind of guy. And I reached down and it wasn't a full artillery shell, but it was the same artillery shell that I was writing about. So this story that I'd created in my mind literally like played out in front of me. It was almost like I created the moment. And that's when it was like, I felt like some type of energy at that point.
Please don't do that again. Don't do that. That's so bad. We have to have a talk later, young man. So, Michelle, you've written a memoir. Memoir is French for not made up. And I'm curious, one, was it always a memoir, or were there other forms and other versions that you maybe tried to approach some other way? But my sort of like deeper question there is, how did you approach the question of like how you wanted to tell this story?
This is a good question. I think that for me, I was either never going to write about it, sort of, or I was going to write about it as a memoir. You know, I guess there's like an idea, like if I ever did write about this in the book, that it would be fiction. But I think when I went to my buffet, I was like, I'm just like not going to write about this, because I really do love memoir. I have a very silly family. They're a big part of the book, but they're just hams, and I always liked writing about them. So that was sort of my plan when I went to MFA. And then I don't know, the story just wouldn't leave me alone. I had to tell it, and I don't know, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about this one chapter that I wrote that like ends up being the third to last chapter. It's called Exit Route, and it's about this time where my dad and I were talking about getting an insurance policy on my grandma, who was like older, and I was like, I'm gonna use all my sugar baby money because I can't be broke forever, and like she'll pass away one day, not to do with me, and then I'll get this life insurance policy. And then I told my dad about it, because I was actually asking him, like, can I get this on you? And he was like, for sure, but you know who's going to die sooner. and so I tried to write that story for my program, and then they were like, something is missing here, because I wrote it without sugar baby in it. So I was just like, this is just my plan for lifetime security. And he was like, there's just something that's not in it. And then I had to add the truth, and then I was sort of like, and I was like, and then he was like, you need to start this at the beginning, but the beginning was like 2.5 years earlier. Yeah. And so that's actually truly how the book came up, because I was not going to write that. I thought this just life insurance policy was funny enough without the truth, and it wasn't, and that's where the book started.
I got whirlpooled down into the truth.
Yeah.
Never trust insurance salesmen. They'll have you end up writing a memoir before you know
Exactly.
it.
I'm not even getting any insurance money.
That's so sad. It's so sad.
She was too old to qualify.
Luigi did it for us all. Luigi was out here doing it for us all. So, Michael and Laura, you are novelists. But this question of like how to tell the story is, I think, like as important for you guys. How do you approach that question of like how you're going to tell the story? So you like track down the soot demon sister creature, and you're assembling your vignettes, your short stories, and yet nothing is feeling quite right. Like what about the form that you landed on felt right, and how did you know it was right?
Is this me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think I have a very pattern-making math brain that loves puzzle piece solving. And so it really wasn't until I had taken kind of a structure, a linked stories collection class at Columbia. That was, I think, the first moment that I realized I was going to be able to write a book-length project versus just short stories. And we were studying these books like Grace Paley's story collection, Toni Cade Bambara's Gorilla My Love, you know, Goon Squad, Jennifer Egan, and kind of just mapping out how they're doing that. And I noticed a lot of the books that we studied did have an example of a writer in there writing some of the other pieces, even though it wasn't actually obvious on first read. I mean, there were a couple examples of that. And I think it's just I had this experience in so many of those books, and now I kind of know how to read as a writer a little bit better, of getting to a point and saying, oh wait, and then flipping back and noting that something I had read earlier was so much more important than I knew at the time, and it just was so exciting to me, and seeing Easter eggs and kind of that whole thing. And so I, even though I never outlined, I kind of mapped out an idea from there, and then that was my project the entire time, to write a book that really needs to be, I think, participated with in order to get the full experience out of it. And it, so that's my answer.
So the first draft that I did before I was playing around with the unexploded ordnance was, I like I said, I had such a hard time figuring out a way into the story because I'm not French. I don't speak French. I have a very hard time. I was trying to speak French from about the age of 10 because that's what I took in school all the time, and could not wrap my head around it. So there was a lot of insecurity around, like, how am I going to approach this culture? And it wasn't until I was moving from New York to South Carolina, where I was going to enroll in my MFA program. I was still in the Marine Corps Reserves at the time. If you served in the military, they're like, if you're going to go anywhere, you need to get new orders in order to transfer units. And as I was a reservist, I was allowed to move to South Carolina, but I needed to do a ton of paperwork in order to do that. And if you've ever worked with the S1 shop, which is the admin guys, you know that they are terrible at doing paperwork. So that resulted in me being in there quite often to get them to correct all the paperwork they messed up the week before. And these were guys, I was stationed on Long Island at the time, and they were there permanently, a bunch of like kind of Guido Italian dudes who were like, just loved working out and talking about what they did over the weekend. And I would just listen to these conversations. And then they would hand me these, like, if you've ever read military or any government paperwork, it's like this very bureaucratic, archaic language that is not the way people talk. So here I'm watching these guys interact naturally, and then they give me these like orders that they wrote. You know, they're using templates, but it's what they're filling out to give me. And I was like, it's so interesting, the dissonance between like the voice of the person writing it and what they actually turn over. So I was like, what if these guys who are disarming these bombs in France, they have to have paperwork too. So what would it look like at the end of a shift where they have to write these reports of everything they've done, and it's the same thing of like, they're playing with these bombs and they're disarming them and disposing of them, but you know, who they're mad at this guy because he ate somebody's lunch in the lunchroom, and like what those, like, you know, who moved my stapler kind of dynamics are going on. And so I just wrote a collection of those reports out. That was like the first draft, was just like a collection of reports over about the course of a month and what that looked like. And that was kind of the starting place, and that was what got me to the next draft. Yeah.
Oh man.
Hearing about other writers' process is so wild. Because I'm like, oh my god, that sounds so hard. I would never do that. You guys are too smart for me. I could never. I'm curious about how you guys decide what goes in. You know, like Michelle, you were saying that, you know, once you realized that you were going to sort of write about it, you had this realization that like, oh, the story then starts 2 years earlier, right? So then, I guess like I'd like to hear from each of you. Like, how do you decide what goes in? How do you decide where the story begins? And does that change over the course of the writing of the project?
Yeah, this definitely changed for me a lot. I had a friend who was like, you have to, because I was like, I don't want to overwrite. It's so exhausting to even write anything.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I hate it, but I had to just accept that I was going to. And so she was like, you have to just write just imagine it's a huge slab of clay, and then you're just like chopping it down, you know? And so I hated that, but I did have to do that. And then at one point I actually did, this is like the Amber Heard trials going on with Johnny Depp. And the second half of my book is like, there's a professor that comes in and he's like quite manipulative, I think quite abusive, and was trying to basically like make money off me being a sex worker. And so at first I was like, I have to take him out because he's crazy and he's gonna sue me, you know. And so there was a draft actually where I wrote the draft, and then I totally removed him. And then again, my agents were like, he's got to come back. And I was like, shit, like, I feel scared. But so I put him back in it. But that was like really interesting to and there's already so much other stuff you have to cut out. But I think like trying to take that out and then to put it back in, I feel like I wrote 2 different books because of that though. Like I feel like actually the thread really sharpened, and I kind of wanted to put it in as minimally as possible, but it still was very strong. But it was sort of a better version, and it kind of cut out all like the excess that I didn't even need. So that was like an interesting technique. But I do think it's like you just have to overwrite, and I hate that. Whenever I heard that, I wanted to die. But I think you have to overwrite, and then you sort of see what matters. And I had whole threads that like my classmates were like, "Oh, you like don't need this," and it was painful to hear, but it was correct.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So like I read the Song of Solomon for the first time about 6 months ago, and it's the ending image of that novel has stuck with me so much. And that's I love novels where there's something that just like lodges in your brain, because with a novel you start at the beginning, you go top to bottom, left to right, and then you get to the end. And the novels that I really loved, when I get to that process, I've basically been given a roadmap. And now, after I've gotten through the roadmap the author's given me, I'm free to go back and explore all these things on my own time. So that's what it's kind of like you're trying to reverse engineer a little bit, because I'm always trying to, an image just by itself is an island. It's not gonna carry the story. But if I can figure out a way to cohesively tie enough of that together, it's not just the experience of reading first page to last page, but some of those things are going to linger with the reader, and they're going to go back over the stuff that's stuck with them in a different pattern each time. Like that's the best novels for me have always done that, and that's what I'm always trying to do.
Yeah. Amazing. Wow, that's so.
I'm definitely feeling the overwriting part of that, and my very first creative writing teacher back from 2011, Ann Napolitano, is here tonight. And I remember being in there, and she just gave me such a great base of like, this takes persistence, like hard work's gonna trump talent, and like 80% of what you write is not gonna make it. And I was like, that can't be right, but but it absolutely is right. But it was, so my book does span 3 decades and a bunch of different locations. The first third of it takes place where I grew up in rural Louisiana. But my main character, Tess, starts out, she's 20 years old, babysitting these 2 kids, like way too irresponsible. She just wants to like day drink and read her horror novels. And what I found when I tried to write linearly from there is that she's someone you kind of have to look away from in order to tolerate as a character and enjoy as a character, which I really do. But I then had to, a lot of my editing was around how to place her and yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Oh yes, please.
Well, I loved your book, and I'm curious. You were talking about Easter eggs now, right? Because these characters do meet each other sort of in these small moments throughout the chapters, and so I'm wondering, like, did you map all that out already, or did you write it and then you were like, oh, I have to go back and connect them somehow, and then you do, or do you already have it planned out? And how do you do that through a whole like book-length project?
Oh yeah. I think it took 4 years, so I do think it's mostly, I never plan anything out really, so just a lot of revision, a lot of, even working with my Unnamed Press editor, Chris Heiser, he'd say, oh, that's a little too heavy-handed, that connection, or, oh, I see what you're trying to do, but you buried it under so much stuff, let's pull that forward. So it was just a lot of trial and error, I think.
Well, you do it really well.
Oh my god, you guys. I'm all teary now. Authors supporting authors. So I warned them about this question earlier. So I always feel like when I'm writing a book that by the end of the book, I am the writer that I needed to be in order to write the book. And that somehow I become that in the process of writing it. And I just think like, well, now the next time I write a book, none of this will be useful to me for the next one. What's one thing that you wish you could airdrop to the earlier version of yourself to sort of make the process easier? Be it a technique, an insight, an idea, an image. Like, what's one thing that you wish you could sort of like drag over and be like, you're gonna need this. You don't know why yet, but you're gonna need it. We'll start with Michael this time.
I would say you don't need so many characters. I'll talk about overwriting. I'm like overly ambitious in every single way. There's like 16 subplots, all these other things. And at some point, I think it was before you got your hands on it, I'd already like realized that this was like the tick that I noticed was I had characters who were just standing with their arms crossed with their hands in their pockets, like off to the side, not doing anything. And maybe they would say like one profound thing at some point that I'm like, okay, but that person doesn't need to be saying this, right? And they're not real people. They're just they're representations. So at some point I was like, we got to cut this in half. And actually, my main character was one of those characters who got seen out the stage left because I realized that the main character was actually a guy who was just in the background for the first couple of drafts. And I was like, this is the story I'm actually really interested in. And so moved him up front and center, got rid of a lot of other people, and then I just had this like core group of people, and I was like, I'm gonna be able to take this much further than I thought. I thought like I would need so many characters for so many pages. Not the case.
Oh, airdropping something to myself. It would probably be about tone, although I don't think I really have a better handle on it now, but early on it was all over the place, and like I didn't know how to make that better except through a lot of revision and a lot of readers pointing out to me how kind of all over the place that was. But I don't know that that's a helpful airdrop because I think, you know, in writing now that's what's happening too, and it's just how my early drafts go.
I guess I would tell myself two things. One is that like this is gonna take 7 entire years working on it. Because I think you think it's the same thing with like cutting it back. You're like, I'm not gonna overwrite 50,000 words, and I'm not gonna take 8 years to do this. But it just happens, and I think I didn't want to believe that. It's the same way you were talking about with your professor being like, you'll cut out 80% of it. You believe it's not gonna be you, but it is all of us. And I think if I could airdrop something about crafting the book, I had this like instinct for a long time that like my first chapter was unnecessary because it wanted to like, this is where I went back to the very beginning, but the very beginning for me was spiritually at Whole Foods. So I started it in that scene of like the dancer or like this cashier being like, I'm gonna be a dancer. And then that was like way too early to the story, and so I had this like entire chapter that I was like so attached to. It was like my darling that I was like could not part with, even though I knew in my body that it was like not. And I think once I finally did cut it, and I had to like I still took that scene remains, and I like put it in the first chapter. But it like taught me so much about editing, because I had to like find the like what actually mattered from that chapter, like what I was super attached to, and then find a way to weave it into the book. And it changed how I edited the entire book though, where I was like, oh, I can cut a lot of shit, and then I can actually just take like what's important from that and then weave it in. Yeah. So I wish I knew that, or I wish I had just done that sooner, because I wasted like I think 3 years being like, this is my baby, and then the baby didn't make it.
Out loud.
It sounded perfect. It sounded perfect out loud. This question about, just like knowing it's going to take a lot of revision, and that maybe not being a helpful note to airdrop yourself, I think it's a really helpful note, because the difference is you now know that on the other side of that revision is like a really beautiful and polished novel. Whereas when you're learning that about yourself, you're like, who knows where this is going? You're like dropping off your precious book at like the meat grinder every finished draft. It's just like, well, here's another one in the grinder. It will never see the light of day. But now you know, like, that's just a part of your process. I think so much of, not to give advice, but like I think so much of writing is learning how you work and dealing with the anxiety. And like, I feel like it's so powerful to realize like, oh, like I just know it's gonna take revision and the revision will work. I actually really love dropping my book in the meat grinder and be like, ha, all the weakness is coming out of it. Each of you took a while on these projects and on these books, which is a testament to the fact that it takes time to write books. But one of the cruel things about life is that as you're working on your book, life and the world go on, and you are often not the same person at the end of that process as you were at the beginning, and the world is not the world that you were living in when you set out to write the book. How do you deal with that, both in terms of you know, you're now looking at the book with very different eyes than you had. You know, when you're going into first pass pages, you're suddenly like, what like, have I made a terrible mistake? But also, you know that this book is entering a world that's like radically different. I mean, I happen to feel that like all three of these books feel so urgent and so tapped into the things that are happening in our world right now that it's almost like you sat down and wrote them yesterday. And I know that like that's not true, but yet they feel so on the moment. So how do you deal with that paradox of the thing that's going to be published next maybe began many, many years ago, you know?
I tell people to just chase their obsessions. You got to look inward. Like I said, I was in this town for two hours and didn't go back for almost a decade. And I stuck with it the whole time because I just felt there was something there, even for years when I wasn't writing. Because, you know, when I was in undergrad, I interned at the Gettysburg Review when it was still around. And, you know, that was the time when like the Hunger Games and all these other books were coming out, and the Gettysburg Review really published like a very specific type of fiction, and yet we got inundated with all these people trying to hit the market because these books are popular. I'm gonna hit this trend right now, and that is, I think, most of the time like a very frivolous and ultimately unrewarding process. So I say look inward and just focus on your obsessions, and that's what you have to write to.
I also have, you know, some writer friends who haven't necessarily been able to let go of a project that perhaps, I mean, I feel is very done and ready because they have that feeling that, ooh, I've moved on from this, I'm a different person. And I think one theme I write about a lot is how we're all a lot of different people in this one life. And I have just seen other people be sort of paralyzed by that, and I do read parts of my work that I think, okay, that's not what I'm preoccupied by right now. But luckily, I think just from reading so many other friends' kind of works and recognizing that tendency in them, I've just, just like let it be itself, and it itself is separate from me at this point.
Thank you. My book's interesting because it takes place from 2015 to 2017, 2018. And like that's when Obama was leaving and Trump was coming in. So it's like interesting that it mirrors this time now. But also, whenever I think of this, like I think of my book as being so American, with like American problems that continue and persist. You know, like I talk about like being like how horrible it is to have student loan debt, and like that remains. That's like worse than ever. I talk about like not having dental insurance or health insurance for like a decade, and like that remains the case for so many people. So I feel like my book is like so American, but it just continues on. I do have a scene in like the opening chapter that I read sometimes that I like to correct, because I was like talking about going to the grocery store, and I was like, I spent a whopping $200, and I'm like, this was 10 years ago, so now this is like $500.
Yes.
You know. So I really feel like this book like remains something that does feel really relevant, and I think people really relate to it, if more than ever maybe.
Yeah, certainly. The insurance,
Yeah.
especially. The price of eggs, guys, it's so expensive. I think now we're in the audience Q&A portion, so if you have a question, please raise your hand for our wonderful panelists. Anybody? Yes?
I have a question for Michael.
Okay.
Mike, there's a tone to this, sort of a looming, not dark energy, but there's a fog. And it's kind of hard to just like put down and then just like go back to everyday life. My wife's like, you want to go for a walk? I'm like, okay. Can you leave work at work, or does that energy, when you're writing it, even linger?
Yeah. So the question is about, I don't know, the seep of the energies in the book following you into civilian life.
Well, I really believe you're always kind of writing in some ways. Like I'm a runner, I go on long runs, and that's always a great like place for me to just let the mind kind of do its own thing. And I'm surprised how often things work themselves out, problems work themselves out from the manuscript, or lines start coming to me. And I would say I don't leave it there. It's always going at some point, but it doesn't feel heavy. You know what I mean? I let the subconscious kind of take over and do its thing, and then when I have to go back to the writing desk, that's a different mode of thinking for me.
I teach undergrads. I can sit here all day. Yes.
It's a question for everyone. Who do you hope finds your book? Is there an ideal reader for you? Who do you envision that being?
So the question is there, who's your ideal reader for these books?
I really think that's so funny because like this is a question you get early on in the publication process of like thinking about publicity, and I still find myself sort of struggling with that answer. But I really think it's someone who wants to participate with a book. I mean, wants to have their own interpretations, wants to be okay with ambiguity, and just like it's kind of unsettling. There's an unsettling kind of going underneath. So someone who's not necessarily looking for a beach read and likes to read about women in their full humanity with all their flaws and all the good stuff and bad.
My book I think is interesting because I don't know, I'm like first generation in my family, you know, and it's definitely a book that I think reaches a lot of different people across different backgrounds. And I think my mom, she's like been reading it now, and I think sometimes when I say like MFA and these kinds of things, like she's like, am I in this world, am I not in this world? And then I think the book is actually like super inviting people that have like don't read actually sometimes too. I have a lot of friends like, I've read a book in 6 years, but I love this. And so I like to think it's like it's for everyone. It's for like you haven't read a book in like 10 years. This one's gonna, you just fly through it. It's not gonna get you, you know, caught up in anything. And I also think that this book works really well in like classrooms, and it is talking about a lot of social issues, and so I think it's like kind of fun because, and I wrote it this way intentionally, where I do think like if you want to just like have a fun experience with the book that's like light and fun, it can be that, but also if you want to have like a deep experience with this book that's like intellectual and political, like that is also there.
Yeah, I mean, since I wrote the first words of this book, 6 major wars have broken out all over the world. There's various other armed conflicts. You know, Ukraine's like the largest minefield in the world now. Gaza's pretty much uninhabitable. And for a reader, you know, I'd be remiss to not mention those things if I'm writing about the subject of war. And it can feel really hopeless, right? It can feel like, what am I supposed to do? And I just know from my personal, I don't have like grand answers or anything like that, but when I've given into that hopeless feeling in my personal life, things have gotten dark very quickly. And really, this is a modern reimagining of the myth of Sisyphus, specifically like the way Albert Camus talks about it, which is that Sisyphus has agency, right? He pushes that boulder to the top of the hill and it rolls back down. He's condemned to this fate. But he makes the decision to turn around and walk back down there. And by doing that turning to going back down, he's claiming his agency. He's claiming control over that and leaning into it. And for me, an ideal reader would be somebody who's looking for what is their personal agency in this very dark and chaotic world we're living in.
That's so scary. That's so good, so good. Other questions? Speak now if ever hold your peace. Nothing. Yes.
Do you ever worry that books are passé, that people are now just so distracted by their phones and by their practical lives that like they just you know like and do you plan to how do you relate a question like do you plan to promote your book actively on social media, or like what is your, how did you manage to keep concentrated on writing a book when there's just so many other stimuli out there, you know, that, sorry, that's kind of a scattershot question.
Our book's pointless, our book's dead. How do you make yourself write a book when the infinite scroll and the void happens?
I think books are always going to be relevant. The way people take them in and, you know, absorb them might change, and the literary culture might change, but I do believe that books are not going out of style. You know, it's you definitely, as a debut author, you have to promote it, or you don't have to. It's the choice is yours. But if you don't, you're probably going to sell a lot less copies right there. But I look at that as like, I don't feel, once again, bring up the hopeless thing. I don't see it as hopeless. You know, I look at it, I'm like, okay, so that's the situation. Now, what do I need to do within the situation? That's the way I look at it.
I think that yeah, it seems like hard to compete with the doom scrolling, but doom scrolling sucks so much, and you don't ever feel good when you doom scroll. So whenever I actually read, I'm like, damn, why do I doom scroll? So I just have to hold the faith that people also experience that.
That's actually a really good point because I did, in a lot of ways, this is a pandemic book, even though it has nothing to do with the pandemic, but I wrote it during the pandemic. And the pandemic was the best thing that happened for my writing because I think of myself as like an introvert with FOMO, so I want to like be out in the world and do what all of my friends are doing, but it is so draining for me. And so just to have that time where I didn't have all these other options to distract me was very helpful, and it's something I mean, I want to be out here with my book, and that's part of this process, and I want to experience this process, but I will have to find that time when I go back to writing. But I also want to say, like, I read something that only 16% of Americans now are reading for pleasure, and I was thinking, I did the math, I don't know, that's still like 80 million people or something. So, but like, I'm just looking for thousands of readers. Like, it's fine, I think. Yeah, with that percentage, that's all.
I know that stat came out, and I will say that ever since that stat has come out, every time I've gotten on the subway, it's been me and like a solid 60% of the train cars reading a physical book, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, why are these people reading? Like, what's happening? It makes me feel bad for not having a physical book, so now I've started also carrying around. And so I don't know, reading is back in New York City in like a big way, and you guys should join the rush. Carry your book around. But it's been really heartening. I mean, I play tennis every Monday in Central Park, and I'm like sitting there early with like I'm reading this out on the Fury, don't ask me why. And I'm like sitting there waiting for my tennis lesson, and I look up and like all the other people at the benches are also reading books in Central Park on Monday morning. Like, it's very, I don't know what's in the water, but reading is back. Do you have time for one more question? One more question. Yes, please.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in like the process of vulnerability in writing, and like whether it's fiction or nonfiction, there's like aspects of yourselves in each of these books, and so I feel curious how writing these books has impacted you outside of the actual book, but specifically maybe also like how yourselves were put into the book and how you got over like that aspect of sharing things about yourself with the world and how that has impacted the rest of your life.
Yeah. So the question is the impact of writing the book on you as people in the world, and also the question of vulnerability in writing.
I think the main thing when I'm drafting is I have to assume no one will ever read what I'm writing. That otherwise I'm just trying to write something no one can ever complain about, which doesn't make for good work. So you just have to I have had to trick myself into believing that, and then by the time you're revising and by the time you get to here, it's such a polished product that it feels so separate from me. But I'm also the type of writer who doesn't plan, and I will find myself kind of like, laughing out loud manically, or like crying to myself, or just like mumbling. So there's just like that whole weird part of it. But I think mainly I just have to assume no one is gonna ever read my work.
That's healthy.
Yeah.
I know that myself.
I think with the writing a memoir, it was really scary, and I think especially this memoir where I really was living like a life that people didn't know about other than my family. And so when I was writing the memoir, I had to also pretend no one was ever going to read it, but it was also the only way I physically and possibly could tell the truth. It was crazy. So for me, it was like really life changing and really, and it was really difficult. Like I feel like I do have a chronic illness now because of writing this book, you know, or the effects of like being in secrecy for 3 years and then writing about it and then having the process of that. Like I feel like it's had a huge impact on me, but it also has like been the best thing of my life because it like made me brave. And sometimes even now I'm like, thank God it's like it tells the story for me in this way, you know. And it gives like a fuller range of the story too. But that feels really vulnerable to be out. Like I think publishing like excerpts from this book has like been really helpful in making me feel brave. But like the whole book itself is like a way, like it's really intimate and it's really like intense. So that feels terrifying, but also it's like kind of a relief, you know. And something that my wife says to me sometimes is like, yeah, but you like the scariest thing possible sometimes feels like my cousins and shit will read it. And then I'm like, but then it's like, but you actually want to be known. You do like actually want to be known. And I think that is true for me. And I think with the book, like it helps me sometimes like do things that I struggle with, you know. So it like helps, and because it's like such a big part of my life, truly. And the work like for me feels vulnerable, but it also feels like it has like helped me dramatically be like more authentic with everybody.
Yeah, because like I was saying before, I had no frame of reference for friends beside this one little trip I took. So I really had to lean into the vulnerability because I tried really hard to find some of these Damon Ears and connect with them and maybe in bed with them, and it went nowhere. I'm not a journalist, I'm a fiction writer, so I didn't need that. But I was like, well, what am I going to do? What do I know? And I had to lean into the experiences that I actually knew firsthand. And I didn't know what it was like to disarm any type of ordnance. I didn't do that when I was in the military. What I did know was working as an EMT, I knew what it was like to work on a truck for many, many hours and to have your days mostly be mundane and boring and then be punctuated with like a really traumatic call where something kind of wild happened, and then you just go back to normal life right afterwards, you know. And that was where I leaned into the vulnerability and where I was trying to, it's kind of sneaky because I'm not like writing a memoir from lived experience, but when you read some of that stuff, that is my experience as an EMT that I'm kind of like spinning into the novel.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for being vulnerable with us, and thank you all for coming out tonight.
I am going to explain how this is going to go, if you give me 1 second. If you're with us on YouTube, click that link, buy those books. If you're with us here, we're going to sell out, and you should be the one to do it. So go back there and buy those books. For the personalization line, we're going to have y'all line up down the center, and the authors will be staying here at the front to sign your books. They are all signed, but if you want a personalized copy with your name in it, and why wouldn't you, you should line up down the center aisle. Another special thing about this event is there are cookies at the front. I forgot to mention this earlier. And they feature the beautiful covers of these beautiful books. So you should get a cookie and pick up all your belongings because we're going to fold up these chairs and turn this place back into a bookstore. But other than that, thank you guys so much and have a great night.